Buenos días a todas y a todos. Es un gusto ser partícipe del 14º Congreso Universitario Internacional de Comunicación, Innovación, Investigación y Docencia. Mi nombre es Beatriz Sáez Pascual y soy doctoranda dentro del programa de doctorado en Educación de la Universidad de Burgos. La presente ponencia trata sobre el prejuicio sutil y manifiesto, actitudes hacia la inmigración en contextos rurales y urbanos. There is greater international migration in the world today than ever before, and this trend is expected to continue. Spain has been a country that receives immigration wherein different cultures coexist. Immigration brings important positive long-term impacts to the local societies and economies, as it contributes to the increase of the host population and improves its socio-demographic characteristics. There are diverse attitudes, both positive and negative, towards immigration. The native population might be prejudiced towards immigrants. Native residents in less urbanized areas tend or harbor more adverse views regarding immigration and multiculturalism in contrast to those in more urbanized areas. Previous studies show increased geographical difference between backwater and cosmopolitan areas over the last decade regarding attitudes towards multiculturalism and immigration. Prejudice remains an unpleasant experience in immigrants' everyday lives, especially for those of stigmatized groups. Ethnic prejudice relies on particular aspects of minorities, coloring them negatively and using them as legitimizing beliefs for discriminatory practices. Such stereotypical representation not only neglect the diversity of rural areas, but also disregard the opportunities brought by international migration for rural places to thrive and be economically productive. It has been suggested that the more different or familiar an immigrant group's culture and norms are from those of the receiving society, the more likely it is that culture trait will be elicited. The objective of this research is to examine the levels of attitudes, subtle and blatant prejudice, as well as their dimensions from native people towards immigrants people in urban and rural areas. The general aim of this research is detailed in three specific objectives: to assess whether individuals residing in rural areas exhibit higher levels of subtle and blatant prejudice compared to those living in urban areas, to compare the levels of attitude, equality principles, and policies attitude between people living in urban areas and those living in rural areas, to examine the levels of attitudes, negative social distancing attitude between people living in rural areas and those living in urban areas. The sample selection was carried out through non-probabilistic convenience sampling. The sample comprised a total of 640 participants. The two data collection instruments used in this study were firstly the scale adapted for the native population by Rueda and Navas in 1996, and the second scale was the scale of attitudes towards immigration by León, Mira, and Gómez in 2007. The scale outlined in the preceding sections was implemented at the educational institutions and in association that work with immigrants of its participants, all of which were part of the educational system in both in-person and online formats. The data collected were coded and analyzed using ABM-SPSS 25 software. To test hypothesis 1, a one-way analysis of variance ANOVA was conducted. The result indicates that there are significant differences based on the context of the participants in relation to prejudice, specifically as shown in table. People living in rural areas not exhibited higher levels of prejudice than people living in urban areas. Therefore, hypothesis 1 can be refuted. To test hypothesis 2, a one-way analysis of variance ANOVA was conducted. The results indicate that there are significant differences based on the context of the participants in relation to attitudes, equality principles, and policies attitudes. Therefore, hypothesis 2 can be refuted. To test hypothesis 3, a one-way analysis of variance ANOVA was conducted. The result indicates that there are significant differences based on the context of the participants in relation to attitudes, negative social distancing attitudes. Therefore, hypothesis 3 can be refuted. The main conclusion of the present research are that people living in rural areas did not exhibit higher levels of prejudice, subtle and blatant, or attitudes, equality principles and policies attitudes, and negative social distancing attitudes than people living in urban areas. Previous studies indicate that prejudice determines the choice for a more homogeneous destination neighborhood, which would imply that over time homogeneous neighborhoods not only become more homogeneous but their inhabitants also more prejudiced. Another studies indicate that living ethnically diverse areas is related to having more tolerant attitudes towards immigrants, and changing ethnic compositions of neighborhood is related to changing attitudes towards immigrants over time. Finally, previous studies indicate that inhabitants of less urbanized municipalities hold more negative attitudes towards immigration, multiculturalism, and European unification as compared to inhabitants of municipalities with higher degrees of urbanization. Thank you very much for your attention.